Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Bertold Kolics from Austin, Texas. Bertold is currently a software quality manager at Mabel. Bertold Kolics, welcome to Maintainable.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been a fan of the show for a long time. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. And thanks for listening. So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of well-maintained or maintainable software?
Well, a few points here. Previous guests have provided a lot of great content here. I just want to reiterate some of those. Since I'm mostly wearing a testing hat, I care a lot about automation, automated testing. It has been mentioned many times before. Automated tests, I believe, document the behavior of your application. So that's a very crucial step to keep a maintainable software. Nobody likes writing documentation. Even if you have documents that you create by yourself, they get often outdated by the time the feature is implemented, or when it is revised, nobody cares to update them. But when you have automated tests that's run as part of your regular software development lifecycle, they do force you to update those as well as if you are changing them. It's just really a must-have if you ever want to do any kind of refactoring writing. That also is part of our craft. Other parts that I also kind of look at is there a lot of dead code or no longer used features in the application? It's just nobody likes rolling that ball forward that you no longer need to. Why do you carry that weight? Sometimes, especially around the start of the year, you hear these stories about people getting into exercising and losing weight, and some of the ways sometimes you hear these apps or making you think about your extra weight is what if you carried like this extra heavy medicine ball with you all the time. And it's the same with that code or unused features that if your customers are not needing it, not using it, then just get rid of it. And pruning your application as you would prune your garden flowers and sown roses. It's important to maintain a healthy code base. A lot of the things that some kind of stacks are better than others with this is that our software has built with a lot of third-party open source components, as well as in the day and age of SaaS products, we often need to use APIs as well. And, these are also something that you need to manage and maintain. And if you don't carefully select what components you pick up, or if you are picking up just willy-nilly without any kind of consideration of what it will mean for you to maintain your software with those dependencies, then it will become a burden on you and will become also a tax. So if you can keep those to the minimum necessary, pick components that meet your criteria of, those are maintained just as well as your own code, then you probably are going to be in a good spot.
Take a quick step back because you mentioned that, you wear primarily a testing hat. So can you talk a little bit about the kind of roles that you're typically playing in organizations? I know, kind of deal with quality assurance and ops roles. So what does that look like in your world?
In the last few years, what we have started seeing is that, there are more and more organizations are adopting the modern testing practices and principles. You can read more about that on moderntesting.org. Alan and Brent, they also run a podcast related to that. Alan Page on this topic. But primarily, testers, test specialists are more and more getting to a role where they work with the development team and enable them, help them to do the testing and themselves. Because it has been, for a long time in our industry, it was usually the practice that you needed to have dedicated test engineers to do even just the basic feature testing. There is a realization that, we may be better or not so good at software testing ourselves, but developers can also learn this craft, and especially when we are talking on the feature level testing. Test specialists can be in a role, in more of an enabling role, to help developers to maybe think about different aspects of how you would approach testing a particular application or code, maybe lower the barrier for test automation by building tools or frameworks, or also even just looking at production data, how users are using the product. Sometimes developers have the tendency of failing to step out of their zone and looking from the outside in, versus approaching things just is normally their way from the code to the outside. And at the end of the day, this also helps the testing specialists to be no longer the bottlenecks, because in the traditional way of doing things, developer creates code and then it's supposedly done, and the tester picks it up before it can be released to production. So no matter what happens, usually, no matter how good your organization is, the testing team in that kind of mode will become the bottleneck. I think it's a much better role for a tester to be an enabler of delivering quality code, high quality code, by telling or helping the team to be better at testing, than being seen as the bottleneck that, hey, he is the guy in the way of us getting to production.
And in the thing that I'm so curious about with how, because I've talked with a number of different people on the podcast where I've seen a lot of different flavors, where there's teams where they're trying to keep it all within the engineering team. Like, oh, we write automated tests. We don't need like someone to manually kick around and do things. And there's other organizations they have a whole large team of people that are responsible for going around and manually testing things. So there's like the spectrum of like what teams can do or should do given on what their context. The thing I'm always really curious about is the thing about that idea of like, how can a specialist, like a testing specialist, help engineers get better in how they think about approaching the software they're writing and the tests that they're hopefully writing to go along with that. It's so interesting when trying to think about, like, you talk about this outside in, and it's like, outside of like the concern of like maybe QA or someone that's doing testing as being a bottleneck for things getting shipped out to delivery, is there more of a concern around just the getting that feedback cycle of like, okay, I think this is where we need to be, and then we need someone to test and be like, oh, there's a couple little things maybe we didn't account for, or this doesn't quite match the spec, pushback. So you get that kind of pushback and you kind of avoid things getting pushed out to production that aren't feature complete yet? Or is it trying to reduce that cycle? Because I'm also curious how well engineers can be super successful also at trying to wrap their head around the whole thing. Given that they're in that space of working on the thing, can they really be effective at testing the work that they're doing themselves? Because they're in a weird way biased because of, just like they have a tunnel vision, like, well, this is how people are going to use it. Here's the happy path or whatever. So I just find that interesting to try to see how teams are trying to navigate that. So it's not, because I think I have an opinion that I don't think people are always really good at testing their own thing. You probably need some other sort of checks and balances in that process.
And that is actually fine. But I think what is a fallacy is that only testers can do testing, which is quite right. And there are a lot of kinds of practices and exercises that can help you deliver that code. As you say, at the end of the day, we want to shorten that feedback cycle. And this is where maybe practices like pair programming, mob programming peer reviews can really help, so that what you deliver, you get the feedback you need, and while you are developing the feature and creating of course the test for it, but you also get the feedback that you need. Also, teams, there are, like, for example, testing specialists, one of these very nice exercises that they can also help facilitate some of these kind of in a gameful fashion, setting up risk storming sessions with the team, that, hey, here are the things on our board for this sprint. Where do we think, and go through with the team what they believe are the highest risk impact to the application, and prioritize their activities around that. And that way, it's much easier for also the entire team, including developers, to internalize what is expected to be delivered, because of course you want to build it right, but you also build the right it, and you need to understand both how those work.
Do you use the metaphor technical debt very often?
I think it is in some cases necessary, and it's all as you say, business context is different. Then you may have to accrue that. But I think just being mindful of that and being aware of that, and dedicating time to address some of that is I believe is also should be part of the planning when you are looking at, okay, we had to do this and we had to cut corners because of certain circumstances, but next time you come around planning or reviewing what the priorities should be, that should be also taken into account and not forgotten. So I think that's the part that I care about more, is that, okay, yeah, we have this and we understand that we are doing this and we are doing this because, and then let's make sure that, we record that fact, so that later when it comes to revisit our priorities, then it comes into play that we had to do this.
One of the things you had mentioned earlier was around documentation, and there's always this, like, testing can be a really great way to, as you said, to document the behavior of the application or the ideal behavior of the application and kind of capture that. Whereas sometimes documentation, if the team organization isn't consistent about how often they go back and update those things, I think we probably both would agree that there's a kind of documentation debt type of issue that we end up accumulating. What about like on the testing level? Is there something like technical, like testing related debt in the same way? That's not necessarily just like, well, we made some coding decisions in this certain way, but do you find that there's sometimes some things that you've decided on the testing level that ends up, you're going to come back and need to optimize later down the road?
Well, I think what should be part of a lot of those discussions is when you're picking certain technologies or stacks or frameworks on the developer side, it's just to, and this is why I also like that developers do their own testing or implement their testing, is that you will be forced to think about the testability of what you are delivering. So if you pick something that is like untestable, like I know that you all work with React frameworks, certain React components, like maybe you are lacking those data test IDs that would make it easier for you to automate certain end-to-end tests, and you may be looking for an alternate one. Obviously, there could be technologies also, or frameworks on the testing side that need to be looked at. Which one is better for my case? Which one is better suited for my application? So that there are times when it may make a lot of sense that your application is written in a particular language. You want to pick the same language for the test framework as well, so that you don't have, or where do you store the test code versus the product code? That also comes up, and of course it's better when they are versioned together, maintained together. On the testing side, as well as on the development side, I feel that even if you have to create documentation, and And maybe in certain contexts you have to because you are in a highly regulated environment. And then I think the best documentation that often works is, some of those high-level documentation that doesn't change very often, and it's probably gives you like a good intro into how the application is put together, what are the bigger components, and the rest of it again could be documented by automated tests or README files that are again maintained and versioned with the repository. It's not someplace else. It's inside within that repository that you work day to day.
You want to take a quick step back as well, and can you tell us a little bit about Mabel and how does the product kind of fit into a team's workflow?
Yes, has changed over the last few years, and Mabel is in this industries that end-to-end testing in the past really used to be something that you did after you deployed either into a local staging or development environment, or in some cases, some companies just deployed into production and do the end-to-end testing after the fact, and it was not often, part of the developer's own responsibility. Again, a separate team is doing that. Mabel can help, and there are of course other vendors in the space. Is that we are as a test automation as a service company that allows you even developers to integrate the end-to-end testing into their workflow. We are not saying, and companies not pushing that's the only kind of testing everybody knows about the test automation pyramid. You have to have testing at the right levels, but the end-to-end testing is really where what the customer and the users are typically going to be using. So you need to have a few of those, and if you can develop that at the same time as you're writing your code, you can shorten that feedback cycle that you also mentioned earlier on. And this is what we are doing. Also, Mabel is in this interesting area that it's a low-code platform, which also opens up creating these, who can author this test. Is no longer just somebody who knows React inside out that can write these automated tests, but you could have, business analysts, product managers also involved in creating authoring tests. They often know these, some of maybe the critical user flows better than maybe the developers, and they can maybe sketch it out, create a skeleton of that test, or even create a test on a mock-up that you can do. We are also, started doing more around mobile testing, as well as API testing is becoming much more important these days that we offer as a service.
And so is that type of thing that you're ideally set it up to run against like staging environments and or production environments as well?
That's right. So we allow our tests again be run against different kind of environments. We have also seen what is really interesting, because we work with many companies where there are still separate manual testing teams or a lot of manual testers that once they start learning how to use our platform, they use Mabel as their platform to teach other teams or others inside the company to learn more about end-to-end testing and test automation, which is not something we expected, but it's like a really good side effect of using a tool like this.
That's nice. I've been meaning to take some time to play with it myself, because sometimes there's projects that come our way, and I'll talk to their teams or leadership people at those potential clients, and we don't think our developers have spent a lot of time doing testing, or they're like, oh yeah, our developers tested it, and when we look in the code, and we're like, well, there's actually no automated tests, or no one's touched the tests and done anything to them in 3 years since maybe you did have someone writing tests, but the last 3 years since they left, your other developers have not kept that going, and it doesn't run anymore. So you could say it's tested. At the end of the day, we know most developers test their code to some degree, and it might be manual click-through testing or whatever, how developers might be testing, checking the values in the database, whatever developer, at some level, I want to believe that most developers test. It's just, are they making it easier for themselves to reproduce those tests so that they don't have to run through every single one of those manual tests every time they make a change, and rather than just crossing their fingers and hoping for the best, which is what I think this whole purpose of this part of our industry is trying to improve that type of example, because that crossing your fingers doesn't work, right? Forever, or at least doesn't work in those conversations when someone says, how do we make sure this never happens again, right? So that's where automated testing and testing teams come into play.
Yeah, and one more thing I wanted to add is that, as I mentioned, that our platform is pretty easy to use. It's low code, but it also provides very rich information when something fails. And because we spend a lot of time checking out, so why does this test fail and how to understand that? And we capture like Chrome step traces or network traffic using HAR files that, then you can point the developer that, hey, go look at this. And because you have all that information, those screenshots and everything that will help you, again, reduce that time so that you can go on to the next task when something fails.
We'll be back with our interview with Bertold in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I wanted to take a moment to say thank you for making time to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers on social media and/or writing a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, is there someone in the industry you think I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Bertold Kolics. So another thing I wanted to dig in with you, because something you mentioned earlier on, we were talking about traits of maintainable code. And one of the things you talked about was like having the exercise of pruning your garden, identifying unused areas of the code or dead code. And I think that can be challenging for teams where, especially if the engineers are kind of far away from the end users or the actual customers. And so you're relying on the product team, or at least I've heard a lot of engineers talk about, well, the product team's always trying to work on the new things that are going to attract new clients and or retain the clients we already have. We need that big list of features to compare to our competitor, even if they're not using it in some way. So there's sometimes unused code that's perceived to be important for that side-by-side comparison. What are some effective ways that you've seen teams be able to go through and identify those areas that they may or may not know if it's being used at all? And have you seen any good examples of where maybe there's an area of the application that's rarely lightly used? You have like that one customer that's using it maybe, but like 99% of them don't. And so I know that at some point you have to make that painful decision, like, well, do we keep trying to support it from that 1%, or should we just tell our customer that that's no longer going to be here? I get that's a couple different topics rolled into one.
Yeah, but I think it is really important, and I'm sure you know that over the years, especially in the last 10 years, what really has changed is we have this this transition from the on-prem installed applications to the SaaS applications. One huge advantage of that is that now all these companies and vendors have access to a lot of data from their users, because you're all collecting that. And if you're not collecting it, you are missing out on something very important. So you can actually measure what parts of your application is being used and being, what is important. And you can even see what the critical flows are in your application. It's no longer guesswork if you, of course, instrument your application properly. And, these can guide those decisions on what to keep, what not to keep. And you can also, look at information. I often work with our support team, but, what are the areas that are causing all these pain points? Because at the end of the day, when you have to maintain this code, there is a cost associated with that. I was really impressed a few years ago when I heard this talk from one of the former product managers at the company, Yammer, where they mentioned that they actually celebrated releases when they removed code or removed a feature, so that they build this kind of culture to keep their code base lean and clean. And one reason, again, new members joining a team have much easier time if you have a well-maintained code base, as opposed to when you have a lot of these hidden areas that are neglected or lesser used. But So to me, that is important now that we have the data that you can use and leverage, and there is no excuse not to do that these days. Is the other part that I think is important is maybe tying or working on figuring out what your business level metrics could the organization or a team think about as those are the goals. And one of my favorite books on this subject is Accelerate, where where they studied hundreds of companies and then figured out what makes it to be a highly successful, highly effective team. What I really like, some of those metrics, for example, your frequency to deploy, or the ratio of failed deploys, what is your lead time, is that these metrics are important to the business, but they also don't prescribe and don't give you exactly how you should be solving it. It still gives all the teams, engineering teams, the independence to figure out and peel back the onion. And so what could we do to make sure that these metrics that we all share and we all understand that are important for our success and beating our competition as well, how do we support those goals? And if you can have this executive and high level support for achieving your goals, then your job or justifying spending time on certain activities is going to be a much easier conversation.
It's an interesting point there you made around trying not to be too prescriptive and giving teams some independence to come up and experiment with ways to try to achieve these types of ideal outcomes, right? And so I think in the industry where we're kind of often looking over our shoulder at our neighbors or our competition, like, well, they're doing it, or there's a really big company, Netflix is doing it like this, and they seem to be really successful on their engineering side. Why don't we do the exact same thing here? It doesn't always work really well, and you can't just always apply the same pattern because it's not the same people. So how have you helped teams understand that distinction there?
It's all context dependent, because you always have to understand what business context you are in, what industry you are in, who are your customers, to be able to, yes, I absolutely agree with you. Just because the squad model at Spotify worked very well doesn't mean that I can just copy paste that into my organization and do exactly the same thing, because Spotify has a particular user base, they have a particular context, they are at a particular maturity in their journey as an organization, but that may or may not apply to my own context. There may be ideas there that are interesting and you should consider applying, but that's not the end all be all. So this is again, in some of the books they describe it very well, is that when you, let's say, join an organization, you want to understand the 3 P's: the people, the product, and the process, and just adjust your approach to that. I've seen it, in smaller startup companies, when you have to, your goal is really to acquire as many customers as possible. You can sacrifice certain things in the name of that goal. But when you kind of mature into a larger business, and then now you have like enterprise customers and that have certain expectations, then you have to adjust your processes as well, and then what is important to you. That's what I think is important is just, you really need to understand the context and adjust and take steps towards those goals with that in mind.
And I think that brings a good way to segue into the topic that you had mentioned when we were talking about some of the topics for this episode. And you had mentioned, getting to that mature point in an organization. I know that, you were mentioning that Mabel. There's sometimes you might be working with certain types of clients, and they might have some interesting requirements that your organization needs to handle. And in particular, there was one around, if in the event of some catastrophic event where, your company is no longer able to perform its functions and maintain the software that the company, your clients, are relying on, there might need to be some sort of failover process for like on the company level for maintaining that software. Could you walk our listeners a little bit through what that process might look like? Because I hadn't heard about that. It reminds me of like succession planning on like a role type of thing, but it's like, it's interesting to think about that on a software level. It's not just like, oh, we're just going to go sign up for a new SaaS application over here and just move over. It's like people are making a large investment with your product, right? So how do they protect their investment of time?
Yeah, that's right. And not at this company. We are not at this stage, but at the previous company, we actually had this contractual obligation for some of our clients that we had a disaster recovery process in place. Especially large financial institutions may want their vendors to attest to that, and this is again just proving that you can recover from a catastrophic event when your engineering site is taken out. How do you recover that, and how long does it take for you to set up an alternate site? And part of it too is that's one thing. The other is that what would happen if your company would go out of business. So I already purchased your software. I have all this invested in it. Well, what do you do? And then is there a independent third party that could take over and not necessarily creating new features, but providing like product fixes or patches if necessary. And we had to go through that, and part of this exercise also forced us to rethink how we are building software, but also just creating some of that necessary documentation that how do you build your software, how do you make it available, and then just started to think, oh my goodness. And then we realized that how many pieces we have and how big this the whole ecosystem is, because we actually at the end of at the time we were still waterfallish model at that time. We created these packages, and we literally had to transfer all the files that made up that particular release to a third party, where they stored it offsite in their vault, and they verified that they could actually build the software as well. And they could give that attestation to our clients that yes, you're all good. The software escrow itself is not very exciting, but to me the part that is interesting about this is that it forces you to go through that process and teach somebody else to do that. And you often have to do that when somebody else is joining your team anyway. So you try to, in several companies, I think it worked very well for us, is when somebody new joins the team, then that's a good point to update your internal documentation as well as they are going through that. It's almost a little bit similar, but it's somebody who is doing that completely independently. You don't even often talk, maybe you exchange emails. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess I get to end up being that third party sometimes, just in the sense that when we end up inheriting a lot of projects from other agencies and stuff like that. So it's always, sometimes we don't even have the benefit of getting to talk to the previous developers. They're like, we got a GitHub repository, or here's a zip file, here's AWS username and password. Make sense of it, but fortunately, usually the applications are running. We don't have to go spin them up like in a new hosting environment right away. So I've learned how to deal with the lack of documentation and the lack of access to to existing team members or past team members and stuff like that. So it's the part of me that really likes to think about it from like an archaeological perspective. Like, what happened here? What were they thinking?
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
So another thing I wanted to dig into, because you mentioned earlier on, was around open source, libraries, third parties, using dependencies. I feel like it'd be a contentious thing to say is using a third party API some form of technical debt just by the decision of it in of itself. I think that could maybe be argued by people one way or another. But when it comes to using libraries, open source libraries, things like that to help you build your application faster because the community people are using those tools, what sort of approaches do you find work well in identifying which ones are worth using or when it's maybe no longer appropriate to use one anymore?
Yeah, there are, the reason why it comes up because I don't think it's people internalize that is actually a debt. Because what if, let's say, an API provider suddenly says, hey, this API is going to be sunset in 6 months, and you either migrate to this V2 version of our API or you're not going to have access to this API, and then you suddenly have work on your hands that you didn't necessarily anticipate. So understanding some of these support timelines around maybe APIs, or when you're looking at open source software, is there a community behind, or is there maybe a commercial support available for it if you wanted to have that kind of level of assurance and level of support on your end, so that you're not at the mercy of the open source maintainer event and how they would update the library if you need a change. Or more often these days, a lot of these open source libraries that you deal with is that is there a vulnerable component in it, because I don't want to ship a product that has vulnerable components. So I personally like looking at, again, is there a community behind? Is it regularly updated? Or maybe is there a reputable organization behind it? Is it, of course, in addition to looking at the licensing and so on, that you have to be compatible with your own context. So these are other good vibe for me, of course, is that and some libraries like some of these embedded databases, they pride themselves that we have like this 95-97% automated test coverage. That gives you like a good confidence that software is maybe well maintained. Also looking at some of their documentation, is it easy to understand? Do you have a lot of examples? Is it easy for the team members to get ramped up if they need help? That is also an important factor in my mind. I've seen better and worse open source components that are in this sense, but nobody expects the source code to be bug-free either. But if you raise something, then you expect some sort of a response within a reasonable amount of time. I also tend to look at, when I look at an open source project, how many open issues do they have, and how many, what is the cadence of them addressing them? Is it just piling up? GitHub and several of these providers also give you an idea with that heat map of the commits going into the repository, so that you can actually see the activity. And sometimes it's not foolproof. We dealt with the components that they were very active up until like 6 months ago, and nothing since then. It's like, but that's a risk again that you may have to consider build into those decisions.
I think it's as someone that produces open source software myself, I definitely, there's like seasons of how much energy I have to work on things. And so it's like, I'm glad to know that there's always a part of me like, well, the code's there. So if anyone really needs to fix something, they can fork it and fix it. Cause it's not like outside of any developer's capacity to do that. Right. I think it's the benefit of open source, not necessarily just treating it as like a product. I expect your support, 24/7 or whatever. So, and if you are listening and you do feel that way towards open source developers, be mindful. But it is code that you can change often yourself as well. So it's like, can we change it is always a thing that I'm always curious about. But I also know that that's not always the thing that people are thinking about when they're looking at, like, say, GitHub repository. They're like, okay, I think a lot of things you point out there are really good things to look at, like how often people interacting, is the issue seeming to build up, or a lot of pending pull requests, is it like too thin of a maintainer group. They're not able to keep up on things. But also is like, I'd also say like there's projects that haven't been updated in a year that are actually be really effective for what I need to do right now. And the code is actually pretty simple. I'm like, okay, that's great. I mean, I can probably snag that and it'll be fine. If I have to make changes, I can probably just do that one day in the future myself. So I think there's just that taking on taking on the burden of being responsible for the whole project versus just making the changes that we need at this point in time.
And I think one other thing that wanted to add here is that I think it's also, some of these companies who are relying on third-party code, just think about ways of how you can contribute back, either, supporting the project financially, many of these projects take Patreon or some other forms of, financial support is good, but also, contributing back if it is, of course, possible if they take it, as you say, because at the end of the day, you're, profiting from it. And so...
Yeah, you are. You get what you pay for, I suppose. So you give back. And then, so thanks for pointing that out. I think that's a good recommendation, a reminder for people. So how involved have you been in running and implementing internship programs over the years?
Yeah, I had the fortune of doing that at 2 or 3 companies in the past, and then we also have co-ops that are at Mabel. What I love, and especially when it comes to software about internship, is that, as you know, it's rarely the case that when you start working for a company after you graduate, that you will start on greenfield projects. And you have to deal with somebody else's code, somebody who may not be there as you often face. And I feel like that, internship just gives you that kind of a opportunity for students to get in touch with the real life and reality, and start working on projects that are used in the real world. What I think is really important is not to segregate the interns into a separate group and they work on some sort of pet project that nobody's ever gonna use, but to integrate them into your team and have them just treat them as regular members of your team. Of course, you will have to help them and guide them to be successful. But if they can see that they can work on the real product, something that customers are used, and they have the power of that, they will be even more motivated. If they can see the full cycle of how the software is made, how the sausage is made, that's even better. That's what interns loved at the companies I work with, is that they cannot get this in the classroom. It's hard to replicate that. The other aspect that I love about it is that also it gives the opportunity for your team to maybe practice some of those leadership roles, technical leadership roles that you may not be able to do if, like, you have a full team of senior engineers. They don't really have much to teach each other. But in that sense, you can also practice that on that side. I also love just having interns around because they just bring a little bit of color to our days, and it's. They always remind us how old we are at the end of the day. But it's just that dynamic, and that you can impact their lives. They also feel really happy when they see that they have an impact on the team, and they are being listened to. They are treated and respected as well. And it's just also, to me, it's a great pleasure to see these interns after they graduate, where they go, and see them being successful in their roles.
That's really great. We've been doing internships here at my company for, I want to say 8 years now, and I think it was about 4 years ago. We're like, we decided we're going to try to do this almost every quarter if we can. And we're never going, and it's just like we want to have people coming in, and we decided that we weren't going to allow it to be a hiring pipeline. We're like, no, let's actually be very intentional about having an internship program that is focused on giving people that opportunity. And because we can't hire everybody, right? And so, and no company can, but I know some companies think about it like, oh, there's an idea for doing this because it'll bring us potentially new talent to hire. And you can do that, but I think it also doesn't really force you to kind of think about how to build a repeatable process without it being like repeatable. Like every intern that we bring in is going to work on something different because of where the projects are at that point in time. And it's like, as you mentioned, I think it's, like trying to avoid like the pet projects and things like that never get used. And it doesn't, like, if it doesn't matter if they finish it or not, then I feel like that's not real world, because why, that doesn't feel good, right? And so, anyways, this is an interesting topic. I love this topic because I feel so very strongly about some of the stuff around putting them on real world projects. When interns come here, they get to work on real client projects. Our clients know that's going to happen, and they're willing to interact with them, so they get some experience of talking to clients. They might only be here for, a couple months, but for them to be able to go to that first interview, I'm like, I went into this internship. I never worked on a large app like that before. And, like secretly I'm thinking some of these projects actually aren't that big, but it's big for them, right? And so I'm like, it's helpful to be reminded of that. I'm like, this is a big thing. And I've become so disconnected with what I thought was like, oh, that's one of our small projects. And like, this is huge to them. And they're just like, whoa, this is crazy. Like so massive. Like, how do you wrap your head around this? And I'm like, great question. And so if anything, it kind of boosts up our own self-esteem in some ways. Like, we know more than we give ourselves credit for. And it's all those questions that people bring to us that you can't anticipate that. And so for us, I feel like that's been a really good way for us to give senior developers a good chance to, exercise and practice those type of leadership, mentoring type skills, which has then made it easier for us to bring in junior developers and recruit people. So we don't always have to just feel like we have a team of just senior developers because we don't know how to mentor people. And it's like, now we have a team of people that all knows how to mentor. They're all expected to mentor, and regardless if they're a junior, mid, or senior level, because now we have even a junior developers, they're providing mentorship to interns. And so it's like we build that right, into the expectations of the job is to not just build software, but also to help your coworkers, your peers develop software and to fill in the gaps and stuff like that. So I think that's been really helpful for my organization. But it's, as you were talking, I'm like, that sounds like so much. I feel like you're saying what I would say if someone asked me the same question. So let's say, get some advice from you. So if there's some people listening right now who might be in a scenario where they're writing code but don't yet have a comprehensive and/or maintained automated test suite, what advice could you offer them to start maybe getting a little bit more direction on what types of tests they might start working on as a starting point? Like, knowing that our audience is primarily likely software engineers themselves.
I mean, it's of course always good especially if you're new to the team, to understand why what is leading to the current situation, just to understand the context, because there may have been decisions made that that's the reason why the things are where they are. The other is that there are a lot of good resources, like there are local meetup groups, and there are online resources, especially test automation. There are a lot of forums, organizations such as the Ministry of Tests, where you can actually pick up some of those ideas and connect with your peers and on where to start, and help you maybe select some of the tools that could cater to your needs. And you can always, as you mentioned often, just start out small. Start with a small experience. Pick an area that either easy to use or is really important or takes a long time and effort to test it over and over again, where you have the biggest bang for the buck, and try to take a stab at it. They often ask, how do you eat an elephant? And one bite at a time. So, you got to start somewhere. And it's okay if you fail, at least you tried and what it is, what is not. But don't be shy of reaching out, even within your team, within your company, or even in your local community, because there are a lot of great resources, a lot of great organizations that are all over the world that can help you get started and direct you in the right way.
I like that. Make sure one bite at a time. Some good recommendations there. My last few questions for you, one I like to ask most people on the show is, what non-software development related book do you find yourself recommending to people most often?
I've heard about many great books on this podcast, but one of my favorites that I just read a few months ago is this book, The Economics of Emotion by Kyle MK. Subtitle, How to Build a Business Everyone Will Love. Because again, this just goes into many details about what we all should be understanding as engineers and developers too. Because at the end of the day, you have to delight your users, delight your customers, bring them value. And then what kind of culture you need in your company also to support that. It's a very concise, a short book on the topic that I really like. It's not necessarily software related, but again, just about our craft, because I like delighting our users. To me, that's even outside just writing code or doing testing is really important because that creates that connection with just sets me up for this is the purpose of why I'm in software in the first place.
Nice. I'll definitely include a link to that in the show notes, and that sounds fascinating. I'm going to have to pick up a copy of that right after we finish this up. Where can listeners best follow your ruminations and thoughts about software development online?
I often post on LinkedIn, and you can follow me on Twitter at Kolics.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely include links to that as well. Well, it's been such a delight to have you join us on Maintainable today, Bertold. Thank you so much for joining us and talking shop.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.